I, 26, female, have been pregnant for around 6 months now, and a week ago my husband, 29, male, and I started discussing baby names. Ideally, this would be a conversation just between us, but my mother-in-law, 56, female, likes to play an active role in our marriage, so she's been given the power to veto names as well for some reason. Now, I have decided not to find out the gender of the baby because I want it to be a surprise, even though my husband insists that we must find out. But anyway, for potential names, I've been considering both male and female names, and even gender-neutral names. Taylor is a favorite of mine. My husband, however, has been stuck on one particular boy's name ever since this discussion started. Oliver. And it's driving me nuts because, like I said, we don't actually know if it's going to be a boy or not. He's actually refused to consider any other names at all. Even after I suggested Olivia, the female version of the name, I had no idea why he was so hell-bent on naming his child Oliver until I found out that he and his ex-wife had planned to name their child Oliver. I was just telling his sister that he's just refusing to move on from this one name and keeps insisting that we name our child this, and she slipped up and told me that this was the name that he and his ex had picked out earlier. I don't think she meant for me to find out and begged me to keep it to myself, or at least just leave her out of it. I found out last evening, and it's been really strange for me because my husband and I have been married for 2 years now. He got married to his ex-wife, his high school sweetheart, when he was 22, but split when he was 24. He met me a year later, we dated, fell in love, and got married. I'd always assumed that he was completely and totally over his ex-wife because he hardly ever talked about her and had cut her off entirely. I didn't even know the full reason, just that they'd been fighting a lot and eventually decided to get a divorce with mutual consent since neither of them wanted to work on their marriage. My husband never told me that they'd been expecting a baby at any point in their marriage, so it was a shock for me. And to want to name our child the very same name that he picked out with his ex-wife was just weird to me. He's not been home for the past 2 days and is due to return the day after tomorrow, but I just couldn't wait that long to talk to him about this, so I ended up texting him this morning asking whether this was true or not. He didn't explain it, but only replied with a "yes, it's true," and left it at that. Then he said that he was busy with work and that he'd talk about it once he was back. I still didn't feel okay with it, and I just needed to talk to someone about this and get to the bottom of it. I guess that maybe my mother-in-law might be able to explain at least something, so I decided to talk to her. She'd been staying at our house for the few days that my husband was out since I needed someone to stay with me. I told her about what I'd found out, and she told me that while she wasn't aware of the exact reason why my husband hadn't told me about his ex-wife's pregnancy, she did mention that his ex-wife had lost the baby 7 months into the pregnancy, and it had hit them both like a truck. Their marriage couldn't survive that, and they separated only a few months after that. She told me that his ex-wife had become a really bitter person from what she knew and had begun blaming her son for every single little thing that would go wrong. She'd pick fights with him all the time, and even though he tried to put up with it for a while, considering the tragedy that they'd just been through, he just couldn't take it anymore. His ex-wife's pain had been more physical and tangible, that's for sure. But he'd been hurting a lot after the loss of the child as well, and I guess that's what led to their divorce. I was moved to tears by what my mother-in-law told me, and I guess it explained why he didn't want to talk about his ex-wife or the pregnancy. It must have been devastating for him to go through that, and on top of it, the divorce must have hurt even more. But I still didn't understand why he'd want to stick with the name that he and his ex-wife had chosen. I think that would have hurt even more, so I asked my mother-in-law about that as well, but she said she didn't know what the reason was. I could tell that she was hiding something from me, and I insisted that she tell me the full truth so that I don't have to stress myself out worrying about this. But she got really annoyed at me all of a sudden and told me to ask my husband about it instead. She also added that eventually, if I refused to let my husband finalize the name, then they might cut me and the baby out of their lives because she doesn't think another heartbreak is good for either her son or their family. So if I'm going to continue fighting with him over something as insignificant as a baby's name, then perhaps I should reconsider my priorities and file for divorce instead of dragging out our marriage. After that conversation, she left the room and left me on my own. I was so taken aback by this sudden outburst that I didn't even know what to say to her, and the fact that she'd even suggested that my husband would abandon me and his child if I didn't agree to name him Oliver just doesn't sit right with me. I'm just so confused as to what exactly would lead to her saying something so extreme, and I can't even ask my husband about it because for the past few hours he hasn't been answering any of my calls or texts. I feel like I might have uncovered something way too intense for me to handle right now while digging up his past. AITA for trying to find out why my husband is so insistent about the name he picked with his ex-wife? Update 1. My husband came back today. My mother-in-law and I stayed in the same house yesterday, but unlike other days, we didn't speak a single word to each other after the last conversation that we had. It felt weird, but I wasn't going to initiate any conversation after what she told me. And this morning, after my husband came back, she left without a word to me, but did say goodbye to her son. Once my husband was done with lunch, I decided that it was finally time to talk to him about what had been bothering me for so long. I told him that I knew what had happened with him and his ex-wife, and while I did find it a bit strange that he'd literally never talked about her pregnancy with me and how they'd lost the baby, I was still okay with it because I knew that it must have been really hard for him. Then I told him about what his mother had said and tried to be dismissive of it because obviously he wouldn't just leave me and the baby just because I didn't want to name our child Oliver. But my husband didn't even hesitate before saying that, yes, he most certainly would leave if I didn't do as he told me to when it came to his child. And he wasn't just referring to short-term decisions like the name, but also later on in life, when it came to raising him, including what school he'd go to, what college he'd go to, how he'd dress, who he would date, and etc. For a second, I was so convinced that he was joking, but there was absolutely no trace of a smile on his face while he was telling me all of this. It didn't even feel like I was talking to my husband then because of how serious and frankly ridiculous he was being. I mean, obviously as a mother, I must have some say when it comes to my own child. I couldn't believe that he was being serious about this as well because this was insane. I told him that I couldn't accept that because, like I said, as the mother, I absolutely needed to have some degree of control when it came to raising our son, and his word couldn't be the last. And then he said that while we could talk about these things once the child was actually born, the name still remained non-negotiable. After that, just like his mother had, he left the conversation and went to take a nap as if nothing he'd said was out of line at all. It's been around 15 minutes since that, and I'm still sitting in our living room and haven't even been able to bring myself to move out of shock. I absolutely cannot believe that my husband would say something like this and threaten to leave his 6-month pregnant wife over a name. It feels surreal just to even think about it. I absolutely have no idea what to do right now. Update 2. He woke up from his nap, and when he did, I was still sitting in the same spot that I had been when he left the room. I think he must have been asleep for around 1.5 hours, and that's how long I'd been sitting there. I was stiff all over, but I just couldn't bring myself to move. He approached me and asked me jokingly if I was still thinking about the naming, as if it really was that funny. I told him that yes, I was, and said that the discussion wasn't over just because he'd walked away from the conversation. He started to look kind of annoyed then and said that we could discuss this once the baby was actually born, because the last time he'd only been able to get to the 7th month before he lost his future child, and he didn't want to go through the same thing again. I understood where he was coming from, but honestly, this isn't a conversation that I can just delay indefinitely. I need to know that the father of my child is going to respect me and my decisions once the baby is born, because I'd be devastated if I ended up ruining my child's life. So I told him that I absolutely needed to talk about what he said, and I couldn't just let it go. He told me that he was still going to stick by what he'd said earlier, and that no matter how disturbed I was by it, that was the truth, and I'd have to deal with it whether I liked it or not. And even added that I was free to leave if I didn't agree with it, because he didn't want to be a part of my life anymore if he wasn't going to have the last word in his child's life. So I left. I'm at my parents' house right now, and he didn't even try to stop me from leaving. I guess this is it then. I don't know if we'll be able to talk things through. But right now, I just want to clear my head because it's all just a blur to me. Update 3. Okay, a couple of hours have passed since the last update and I'm feeling considerably better now, so I think I can elaborate more on exactly what happened before I left. After my husband told me that he wasn't going to take back what he said and that he definitely meant it, when he said that he wasn't going to be a part of his baby's life anymore if I didn't let him control all aspects of the kid's life, I was so pissed off and just couldn't accept what he was saying, so I decided to argue with him. But as usual, he just left the room and didn't even bother to respond to me. So I lost my temper, packed up some of my stuff and drove to my parents' house. It's a little past midnight right now, and I'd reached my parents' house at around 7 in the evening. I was so shocked that he let me leave without a word that I didn't even explain anything to my parents and just cried myself to sleep. After my last update, he still hasn't texted me, and I don't think he's going to. But right now, I'm neither in shock, nor am I upset, but just furious that he's doing this to me. I've been with him through thick and thin these past few years, and this is how he treats me? Just freaking brilliant. Update 4. 2 days have passed since I moved back in with my parents, and today I finally told them what was happening. I've been trying my very best to make it seem like this is just me visiting them because I miss them, but they could sense that I was lying and something was really off. I finally broke down and told them today. I had no idea how they'd react, given the bizarreness of the situation, but they were shocked at what my husband had said, and my father even wanted to knock some sense into him. That's how angry he was on learning what I'd been told. I managed to stop him, but they were definitely not being as forgiving as I was, and told me that if he still hasn't even bothered to apologize or ask my whereabouts, then I'm better off without him and should probably file for divorce at the earliest. I don't know if I want to go through with that, though. Of course, my parents aren't going to pressure me into it, but I can tell that they don't like the idea of me waiting around for my husband, since they're convinced that he's the worst choice for me to stay with right now. They've always liked him, but this just changed everything for them and for me. And yet another thing that's been bugging me is the fact that my husband and his mother have started acting weird only after I announced my pregnancy. Before this, things were pretty normal. I just can't shake off the feeling that something's seriously wrong about this, and I need to find out what before I take any further action. Update 5. As I had mentioned earlier, I wanted to find out what exactly was the issue here, and why were my husband and mother-in-law being so weird about this whole pregnancy thing. But I had no idea where exactly to start, because my sister-in-law, who'd been the first person to talk to me about this, had been suspiciously quiet ever since and hadn't responded to any of my calls or texts ever since I'd left. unsurprisingly. And asking my husband's friends was pointless because they knew as much as I did. He didn't have any childhood friends here because he'd moved to my city only a couple of years back. So I took a leap of faith and contacted the only person I knew for sure who would be able to tell me everything about this without my husband's knowledge, his ex-wife. It wasn't tough tracing her down at all, since my husband had actually made me block her everywhere when we first announced our engagement out of fear that she tried to get through to me and ruin our relationship. I'd done it without questioning any of it because this seemed like a pretty normal demand, but now I know it was because of what he was hiding. I unblocked her and sent her a hi, coming straight to the point once she'd replied to my first text. I asked her what exactly had happened between her and my husband, and why had they gotten a divorce, and why was he still insisting that we use the name that they picked out. Now, what she told me next absolutely disturbed me to such an extent that I wasn't even able to fall asleep that night. Apparently, when they got married all those years ago, things were going pretty smoothly for the first few months. But then he started dropping hints that he thought it was about time that they started trying for a baby. His ex-wife was hesitant since she was so young, and they weren't financially stable enough to handle having a kid yet either, so she would try to ignore it. But eventually, once they hit the 1-year mark, my mother-in-law got involved as well, and they constantly tried to pressure her into agreeing. She finally agreed and my husband was thrilled, but then they struggled to conceive. They went to several doctors and eventually found out that she had a medical condition that was making it difficult for her to conceive and would lead to complications in her pregnancy, even if she did somehow get pregnant. She wanted to stop trying, but my husband insisted that it would be all right, and that led to a lot of arguments. He said that he'd file for divorce if motherhood wasn't in the cards for her, and mostly out of fear of losing him, she stayed with him, and finally she did get pregnant. However, the complications did persist throughout her pregnancy, and, like I already know, she lost her baby in the 7th month. It was hard for me to hear her talk about it, but the worst was yet to come. She told me that around the 6th month they found out the gender of the child and they were going to have a girl. She was happy about it, but my husband seemed to have lost interest and didn't even seem affected once he realized that his baby was gone. They had also decided on the name Oliver in the initial stages of the pregnancy, but once she lost the baby, he just stopped caring, which is what led to the fights and arguments. Eventually, it was his sister who told her that Oliver was actually the name of their youngest brother. 10 years ago, they'd been driving back home from a party and Oliver had been sitting up in front of their dad. His dad had been slightly inebriated and, well, that led to a car crash that led to their father's death on impact. My husband and mother-in-law survived with a couple of injuries, but nothing that wouldn't heal. Oliver, however, was in critical condition, and after 10 days he succumbed to his injuries. My sister-in-law had been at a friend's house that fateful night and had refused to attend his party, so she didn't have to witness anything firsthand, but I guess that survivor's guilt did something to my husband and his mother. After learning that, obviously, she couldn't just stay with him anymore because she realized that in some messed up way, her future child was supposed to replace his brother. So she left. She never let him know the real reason, but she suspected that on some level he knew. He didn't try to stop her either, and after they ended their marriage, she was cut off from him entirely, and she was okay with it as well. When she learned that she was engaged to someone new, she'd considered reaching out to me and letting me know what I was getting myself into, but by the time she was able to find out my name, I'd already blocked her. She apologized for not trying harder or not speaking up about this to spare other girls from going through what she did, and while I don't think it was her fault, I still do think that it could have saved me a lot of trouble and heartache. It's been a week since the last update, and 3 days since I learned about my husband's past. He hasn't texted me, and it all makes sense now too. Our baby was nothing more than a way for him and his mother to find a replacement for Oliver, and it's incredibly messed up. I don't even know what I feel right now, but I do know that this marriage is over. I just cannot go back to him anymore, and neither can I ever see him in the same light again. I've told my parents everything that I know, and they immediately contacted their family lawyer so that I could file for divorce. Today is the day that my husband will be served with the divorce papers in a few hours, and well, I just don't know how to feel, so I'm venting here. I hope everything goes well. Update 6. He finally called me. He asked me if I intended to go through with the divorce, and I said yes. He didn't seem sad or anything, just resigned. I told him that I knew everything, and even though I was sorry for his loss, I just couldn't let myself and my baby be a part of something so extreme. I suggested that he seek therapy to deal with this, and he hung up on me without even saying goodbye. So I guess that's it. I'm going to make sure nobody else makes the same mistake as I did, though. It's going to take a lot of courage, but I'm going public with this information. It might affect my divorce settlement and my subsequent relationships, but I don't care. I just don't want anyone else to experience this anymore. Update 7. I posted it, and well, he blocked me immediately afterwards. It's been an hour and the post is still up. He hasn't called or texted or tried to convince me to delete it, so I guess he doesn't care anymore, which is fine by me. I've turned the comments off, but a lot of people have reached out with kind words, a few with harsh ones, but it's all right. I can handle it. I just hope I can handle what's to come as well. Update 8. So my divorce was finalized around 3 weeks ago, and I'm officially single now. Yay to me! I also gave birth to a baby girl, and I'm thrilled to be a mother. I've decided to name her Janine, after my great-grandmother. I have full custody of her since my ex-husband didn't want anything to do with me or his child. I was incredibly sad the day our divorce was finalized because my daughter was never going to have a father. But now I guess it's okay, since it's better to not have a dad at all as opposed to having one that doesn't care for you. I haven't heard from him for a long time now, or from anyone else who's connected to him for that matter, and I have made my peace with it. Janine changed my life already because I'm just a significantly happier person now, and my sole aim is to raise her to the best of my abilities and give her all the joys in the world. And maybe someday, hopefully, I'll have completely forgotten about my husband altogether. Stay tuned for more stories from Argo Relationships.